Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday Lies, guys. We're here today, and we're going to be continuing on with my talk I did a couple weeks ago about working with pre-cuts. So when I did that one, I talked about fat quarters, and then we have our little 6-pack bundles of 6 coordinating fat quarters. And at the time, I like to develop little patterns that work with our 6-packs. So during that talk, I talked about how you can cut up a fat quarter into the different pre-cut sizes. So when I did that, I found that with a fat quarter, I could cut a 10-inch square, which is AKA a layer cake, right? And I could get 2 10-inch squares for my 10-inch strip. I could also cut a 5-inch strip, and I could get 4 5-inch squares from that 5-inch strip. And then I had enough left to cut my 2.5-inch strip. And I could get 8 little squares from that 2.5-inch strip. So again, from each fat quarter, I got 2 10s, 4 5s, and 8 2.5-inch squares. So then, once I have something to work with, now I have to think of what do I do with them, right? I didn't have a plan ahead of time. So about a week later, I was on a quilting retreat, and this was my homework on the retreat to come up with an idea to do something with these. And so this is what I came up with. And I ended up coming up with 2 different projects, of course, because that's the way it works. So I started with, because I have 2 large squares from each fat quarter, I divided them into 2 piles. So, and I had cut up all 6 of my fat quarters the same way. So I had 2 10-inch squares from each one, 4 5-inch squares, and 8 2.5-inch squares from each one of these. Okay, so all the colored fabrics in here were my fat quarters. And then I added this kind of honey-colored background because my theme for my fat quarters was bees. So I split my 2 10-inch squares from each fat quarter into 2 piles. So I was working with 1 of each for this block and 1 of each for this block. And then, I'm going to look at my blocks here. I started with my 5-inch squares. Okay, so if I had my 10-inch square, and then I decided to take and put my 5-inch squares around that. Okay, so we're going to pretend that these are 2 different fabrics. So obviously a 5-inch square and a 5-inch square, equals a 10-inch square. However, you have the seam allowance, right? So once I sew these 2 together, I would be a 1/4 inch short, or a 1/2 inch total of my 10-inch square. So I needed to, what this little gold in here is, I needed to fill in that seam allowance. So I used my coordinating background fabric. Okay. And then I did that on the other side, right? I had 2 fabrics. I filled in my seam allowance space. And then obviously these are 5-inch squares, so I needed to fill in my corner with an additional 5-inch square. So that gave me block number 1, utilizing 1 of my 10-inch squares and 4 of my 5-inch squares. Okay. Then I had my other stack of 10-inch squares, and for this one I wanted to use my 2.5-inch squares. Okay, I like to refer to them as my polka dots, just because it's easier to say than 2.5-inch squares. So again, I had my 2.5-inch squares, and again I'm using different fabrics, and I'm going to put 4 of them on this side and 4 of them on this side. Now the first time I made this one, right, I was in the cutting mode. I cut my 10-inch strip and my 2 squares, and I cut my 5-inch strip and my 4 squares, and then I cut my 2.5-inch strip, and I chopped it into all my little 2.5-inch pieces. Which also meant that I had to cut, where'd they go? I had to cut up all these little 2.5 filler strips to go in between them, which meant a lot of little, right, put it together, zip, put it together, zip, put it together, zip. And as I'm doing it, I'm like, well, dummy, don't cut up the squares ahead of time because I have to do a lot of these. So when I did my second one, which we'll talk about in a minute, I decided, oh, if I left my strip whole and sewed on my filler strip, now, and I'm just going to grab a cutting board here quick. Now when I cut these up into my 2.5-inch squares, I already have that filler strip on there. So it's a lot, I don't think that was 2.5. It's a lot more accurate than doing all that little zip piecing, because you can have a lot of movement when you're doing those little pieces. Your ends can kind of wing out at the start and stop of each one. So this was a lot more accurate in cutting up these littler pieces if you actually cut them the right size. Okay, so I ended up with all my 2.5-inch squares that already had that little piece on. It didn't work so well with the 5-inch squares because I only had to piece 2 of them together, so that was easier to do just separately. So after I have these 2.5-inch squares all chopped up, I'm going to sew them together into a row, right? And I'm going to be losing that 1/4-inch seam allowance, which is going to give me my 10-inch square. Because I cut it this way, I ended up having an extra one of these on the end, which I don't need. But I still found it easier to strip piece this, chop it up, and then just at the end, just take one of them off. Okay? If you prefer to do it this way, absolutely go ahead and do it. It's your quilt. You can do whatever you want. I just thought this was faster. So this is the way I write it in the pattern, but you don't have to follow my instructions if you choose not to. All right, so once I got my row of my little squares, obviously I wanted these 2 blocks to be the same size, so I still had to have my 5.5-inch corner. So with these, I had the same size. With this one, obviously I need to fill in the space in between there. So I had my filler strip, which then gave me my same 14.5-inch block as what I had over here. So I had my row of polka dots with my fillers, my larger filler strip to equal my 5-inch width, and then I could assemble the block. Okay. When I first was thinking of doing this, my plan was to have my little polka dots up against the block and my filler strip out here. Okay, that would have given me the outside edge of my block having more of a sashing look. But when I started doing that, because I needed 8 squares and I only had 6 fabrics, no matter what, I was always going to have one of the fabrics that matched my center square up against my polka dots, which gives you that look like this block bled into my big one, and I didn't like that look. So I ended up flipping it so my solid square was against the big block and my little squares were on the outside. Problem with that was when I started laying them out, now my little polka dot squares are going to be up against the next block. So with this one, I felt I had to sash out in between the blocks to make each square an independent block on its own without it touching the other square. And that worked just fine, okay? When I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, it would have been so much easier if I had centered these and just put a smaller filler strip on either side of my little polka dots. Now I don't have to worry about these guys ever touching one of the big squares, okay? So that's the way this quilt was done, my second one, okay? So again, I have my big block here. This is my polka dot strip with my 2 small filler strips. And another one down here, and then my center square. So my block was here for my little ones, and then my next block was here for my bigger ones. These did end up touching this, but I usually could work at that. I didn't have the same one touching, so I was okay with that. Okay. If you felt that you wanted to sash this one out too, absolutely you can, because of course it's your quilt and you don't have to follow my instructions. Okay. This is just what I came up with. As I was writing the pattern, I was going to try to put both of them into one pattern, but it ended up just being too complicated with, you had to cut a little different, you had a piece a little different, one had borders, one didn't have borders, so I ended up splitting it into two different patterns just for the ease of confusion when you're trying to follow a pattern. So this one actually I named first because every time I was making these, it kept looking like a ladder to me, right? So I named this one, it's part of our Mix 6 series and it's called Ladder. And then when I was doing this one, I'm like, well, I don't have a ladder, but it kind of looks like a staircase with a landing and a staircase with a landing, and you kind of get this zigzag. So this is Mix 6 Landing and this is Mix 6 Ladder. Both of those patterns are on our website for sale. For either we can mail them to them or they are downloadable, and you save a little bit of money if you download them yourself and just print them out at home. This one also, we decided to add additional stop border that was the same size as our sashing, and then an outer border just to show that it can be a little bit bigger. This one we dealt with just the 6 fat quarters and I don't know if it was a yard or a yard and a quarter or something of my background fabric. And then we just bound it. So it's kind of showing you that this is a little more of a baby size. This is getting to be a lap size. Or you could buy additional fat quarters and make it even bigger. So from each fat quarter, you're going to get 2 blocks. So this one ended up being a 12-block quilt, 3 across, 4 down. If you want it to be bigger just with your blocks, you can make it, 5 across and 6 down, which is 30 blocks. So obviously that would be 15 fat quarters. Okay. So it's fairly easily adjustable because you're going to get 2 blocks from each fat quarter. The quilting on them, I guess we had a question, was this one I quilted on the long arm. It just has a swirly design. I don't know if you can see this online, but this one we ended up quilting on the embroidery machine.
You can see the one behind your head.
This one? This one?
Yep.
Okay. So we picked kind of a square geometric design that was built right into the machine. We were able to size it down. So this is a 9.5 inch fitness block. I think we made this 7 or 7.5 inches. And we just hooped it and we centered that little design right in the center of the block. Prior to doing that, just to hold it together nicely, we just machine stitched and we followed my little ladder. We followed that line all the way down, all the way through on both sides. And then we came back and we did the same thing here. So it created this little kind of a Mach 9 patch in here. And then across my 5-inch squares, it created a line that mimicked our little ladder line. So again, you can do some straight line quilting just to hold it all together. And if you have an embroidery machine, it's a great, nice big square to do something fancy or decorative in those big squares with your embroidery machine. All right, so this was a pretty quick and easy one today, but I hope you understand how my thought process works when I do this stuff. There's a lot of things you could do with these squares. Chop up a fat quarter and play around with it, see what you can do. These were the 2 things I came up with. Doesn't mean there won't be more coming down the pipe at some time if I think of something else. But for now, if you have some 6-packs laying at home, you can cut them up, add a background sashing color to them, and go ahead and play. Hope you enjoyed our demonstration today, and we will see you next week. Hope everybody is good and healthy and safe, and the warm weather is starting to come around, so we're all happy. Have a great day. Bye.